Before we get into this, forget everything you know about meal planning. Forget the grocery run, the refrigerator, the microwave. Picture a trapping camp deep in the North American wilderness. Snow outside, smoke inside, no roads, no towns, no resupply until spring. Thousands of trappers, voyageurs, Métis hunters, mountain men spent winters in places where running out of food could become deadly very quickly. And most of what kept them alive was not memorable, not delicious, not even enjoyable. It was simply the food that lasted. Salt pork. The slab hung near the door, pale and stiff in the cold. Salt pork was the backbone of provisioning throughout the fur trade era. The Hudson's Bay Company, one of the major fur trading companies in North America, shipped barrels of it to remote posts year after year. It wasn't chosen for flavor. It was chosen because it lasted in cold storage weeks or months without spoiling. A trapper cut pieces off and fried them slowly in a blackened pan over a low fire. The rendered grease was kept. In a camp where calories were survival currency, you did not pour fat away. A man burning energy in -30 temperatures needed fat the way a lamp needed oil. Some trappers added that grease to almost everything else they cooked. It had no ceremony to it. It was medicine in disguise. Cornmeal bread and bacon grease. Cornmeal traveled well in damp conditions and lasted longer than finer wheat flour on long journeys. In many frontier camps, particularly farther south and among American trappers moving westward, simple cornmeal bread became common trail food. Cast iron was already the universal cooking vessel across much of North America by the early 1800s. A skillet or Dutch oven could sit directly in the coals. The bread cooked in that heat came out with a hard crust and a heavy center. Men packed pieces into their coat pockets before heading out to check trap lines that might stretch 6 or 8 miles through country you wouldn't want to cross in summer, let alone January. Bacon grease stirred into the mix gave it more substance. This was not a recipe passed down for pleasure. It was problem solving with whatever hadn't frozen yet. Pemmican. This is the one that deserves the most respect, and the one that most people today have never heard of. Pemmican came from indigenous communities of the northern plains and forests who had spent generations working out how to turn food into something that could survive a continent. Dried meat, usually bison, sometimes caribou or moose, was pounded into fine fibers and mixed with rendered fat. Dried berries were sometimes added before the mixture was packed tightly into hide bags. Done right, it could last a year or more without refrigeration. The Northwest Company, a major rival in the Canadian fur trade, built entire supply routes around pemmican. Métis hunters on the plains produced it in huge quantities and shipped it east to feed voyageurs, making long crossings through the interior. Without pemmican, the fur trade as it existed simply could not have functioned. A trapper eating it alone by a fire at night was participating in something that stretched back centuries before he arrived. Bean stew. When a supply canoe or pack train made it into camp before the rivers froze, dried beans often came with it. A pound of dried beans weighs almost nothing and feeds a man for days. The stew cooked long and slow in an iron pot. Beans, salt pork, whatever else was available. The cooking filled a cabin with warmth more than it filled it with smell. Men repaired gear near the fire while the pot simmered. Wet gloves dried on sticks. The stew thickened over several days as water evaporated and fat worked into the beans. In larger company posts, places like Fort William or Cumberland House, communal cooking of this kind was part of daily winter life. Shared meals were one of the few social anchors available in months of isolation. Hardtack. Sailors had been eating it since before Columbus. By the time trappers were working the northern forests, hardtack was already centuries old as a survival staple. Flour, water, salt, baked until it could survive almost anything a wilderness could throw at it. Almost anything except a human jaw, unaided. Most men soaked it in coffee or dropped it into stew and waited until it softened. Stories of broken teeth were not exaggerations. It was made to outlast the journey, not to reward the man who finished it. A piece of hardtack in the bottom of a pack could sit there for months and still be edible when everything else was gone. That was the entire point. Dried fish. Along the rivers and lake shores of the north, places like the Mackenzie River, fish were part of winter survival long before European trappers arrived. Trout, whitefish, and pike were cleaned, salted, or smoked, then left to stiffen in the cold air. Trappers adopted the practice because it worked. Dried fish could be carried and chewed while walking, leaving both hands free. In terrain where a misstep meant a broken leg, a day's walk from camp, keeping your hands available was not a minor consideration. The taste was sharp and dry, and not something most men would have chosen back in Montreal or St. Louis. But out on a trap line through waist-deep snow, nobody was thinking about comfort. Rabbit stew. Fresh meat was rare, and when it appeared, it came mostly from snares. Snowshoe hare were plentiful in the boreal forest, but trappers understood, or quickly learned, that rabbit alone was not enough. Rabbit meat is almost entirely protein with almost no fat, and a man trying to survive on it exclusively would grow weaker eating more. Frontiersmen called it rabbit starvation. Physicians today call it protein poisoning. So the broth mattered. The salt pork rind thrown in mattered. Even the flour thickening, it mattered. A rabbit in the snare was welcome, but nobody celebrated too hard. The wilderness had a way of reminding men not to count on anything. Fried mush. Cornmeal mush, cooked soft, left to cool and set, then sliced and fried in grease the next morning, was cheap enough that almost any camp could afford it, and filling enough that it carried a man through a cold morning. The outside crisped in the pan. The inside stayed dense. Men ate it before dawn, before speaking much, before heading back out into the dark. Winter camps had their routines, and those routines were held to strictly, because routine was the thing that kept isolation from becoming something worse. Beaver tail. Trappers were not sentimental about the animals they pursued. Beaver were caught for their pelts, which drove one of the most profitable industries in 18th and 19th century North America. But the meat did not go to waste when the camp needed feeding. The tail in particular roasted slowly over open flame until the tough outer skin blistered and pulled away, yielded rich, fatty meat beneath. Experienced men in the field considered it good eating, and journals from the fur trade era mention it repeatedly. Fat was always welcome. In that sense, beaver tail made perfect sense. Bone broth. Late winter told the truth about how provisioning had gone. By February or March, in a remote camp, the flour was nearly gone. The salt pork was down to scraps. Coffee, if there had been any, was long finished. Bones saved from earlier meals went into the pot and were boiled for hours, boiled again the next day. The resulting broth had little caloric value, but it was hot and it was something to hold. Sitting beside a fire in a trapper's cabin in late winter, listening to the forest crack and contract in the cold outside, a man wrapping both hands around a tin cup of bone broth was not enjoying a meal. He was calculating whether he could make it another 6 weeks until the ice broke. Most did, some didn't. Spruce tea? By late winter, fresh food had disappeared months earlier. Men cut green spruce tips from frozen branches and boiled them into a bitter tea that tasted more like the forest than anything meant for drinking. Indigenous communities across the north had long understood that spruce tea could help prevent sickness during the winter months. Knowledge later adopted by voyageurs and fur traders moving deeper into the interior. In isolated camps, especially after months without fresh produce, the drink became more than comfort. It was survival. The steam filled the cabin with the smell of wet pine and smoke. Men drank it quietly beside the fire while snow pressed against the walls outside. Nobody pretended it tasted good, but camps that remembered spruce tea often stayed healthier than camps that didn't. Molasses and snow. In French-Canadian winter settlements, molasses carried a specific comfort, cheap enough to ship north in barrels and sweet enough to break the monotony of winter. It gave men a brief reminder of something softer than camp life. Sometimes it was poured over packed snow, in a tradition similar to maple syrup poured onto snow during sugaring season. It gave a quick burst of energy and something briefly resembling pleasure. Men talked about foods the way they talked about home, which is to say, they talked about it when they thought no one was listening, and they remembered it long after everything else from those winters had faded. Jerkies. Dried meat lasted. That was the only qualification required. Moose, deer, bison, whatever was available was sliced thin, salted, and dried over smoke or in cold air. The technique was indigenous in origin, adopted wholesale by European and American trappers because nothing else moved as well or kept as long. A man could carry enough jerky in his coat to survive several days if he had to, and sometimes he had to. Chewing a strip slowly while walking alone through miles of spruce and birch and frozen creek beds, that was as close to ordinary as a trapper's day got. No conversation, no news. Just the sound of snow underfoot and the knowledge that the trap line had to be checked regardless of what the sky was doing. These were not celebrated meals. They were not written about in the cookbooks of the era because the people who ate them did not write cookbooks. They wrote ledgers, or they wrote letters home that sometimes arrived and sometimes didn't, or they didn't write anything at all, but they survived. And this is what surviving looked like.